Welcome to Leader You by Black River Performance Management, where we believe work should fuel the human spirit, not drain it. In this leadership podcast, we will dive into the lived experiences of people flourishing in today's workplace and beyond. Join us to hear real-life examples of experiences from our own lives and from the leaders we know and trust. Hello, and thank you for joining us today. We're excited to have you today for our Demystifying Motivation. For those of you that missed part one, we will quickly recap the key concepts. And I want to introduce myself. I'm Angie Lion, and I am co-owner of Black River Performance Management, where we believe work should fuel the human spirit and not drain it. Black River is a consultancy that focuses on enhancing human flourishing and organizational success, not at one expense of the other. Our services range from culture enhancements and turnarounds to leadership development, team and group facilitation, and addressing performance deficiencies. I'm the host of Black River's Leader You podcast, and today we've chosen to spend some time exploring the science behind motivation. My guest today is my husband, Rob. He's a professor, a researcher, and a consultant specializing in translating the science of human behavior into accessible and understandable applications for people and organizations. When Rob isn't working with students, he supports organizations with troubleshooting challenges and facilitates high-stake meetings. Today's session will begin a quick overview of the motivation elements we discussed in part one last fall, and from there we will discuss motivation based on various questions submitted to us. Then we will return to the chat section to answer any additional questions. However, before we jump into part one, I want to start with the first question that was submitted to Rob and ask Rob, what motivated you to explore the science of motivation, and how do you envision it impacting leadership and personal development? Rob?
Good questions. All right, thank you. I'm going to handle those in two separate pieces. So my formal training was in the area of organizational success, performance, improving performance. So I spent a lot of time learning about how to design systems, influence systems to address deficiencies. And it seemed like regardless of how well we did that, there was a problem. There was an underlying issue that was derailing those efforts. And as I sat back and reflected upon it, one of the challenges is that we were constantly handling the human element as static and consistent, meaning that we just have to tell people what to do and they're going to do that. And that is really far from the truth, right? So people are dynamic. They experience a wide range of emotions and experiences throughout the day, let alone really quickly. And so we can't just tell someone to do something and they're going to necessarily do it, right? So from there, I started to look into behavioral sciences and better understanding what is the human condition. And actually what was interesting, and you mentioned the motto of of Black River is to work should fuel human spirit, not drain it. My shift from the intervention and solution world to the behavior and psychology and human condition world resulted in a shift that followed a lot more compassion, love, and an emphasis on human flourishing, whereas the prior was more about organizational success. And so now what we try to do, and I do this in my classes, trying to teach students that we don't have to give up one for the other. And so what I've done is I've worked backwards to better understand people to the extent that we can better influence those outcomes, regardless of what the issue is. And actually right now, as you know, I'm on sabbatical for the next year, going into a new line of research, which is even going to move us back even further in terms of the human experience to see if there's certain things that we can do with certain aspects that we can hopefully predict behaviors and actual cultural fit better. But more to come on that later. Now, the second part of the question was something about leadership or how
do you see it as impacting leadership and personal and team development?
Yeah, so if I look at what my view on this was, I had to step back and reflect that I didn't have all the answers. And I think there's a slowing. The lesson to leaders, I think, and to self is that we need to slow things at time. And even though we might be really proficient at certain things, we're probably proficient further down the line than we should be. and that there's more further upstream that we need to look into to better understand this, right? So some people do things very well naturally. They connect well with people naturally. They support people well naturally. But all of us have our talents, but all of us have our deficiencies too. And what it resulted in it was that I needed to peel back the layers of the onion further to better understand what those things were that were influencing joy and success and organizational success and human flourishing in the workplace.
That's great. Well, I'm excited to ask you a lot of the questions that we have from our last webinar, but also dive into more. But let's first look at the model,
Okay.
the Black Rivers model. And can you give us a recap of CAR and how we use that?
Sure. We're going to throw the model up on the screen real quick here. And once it's on the screen, I'll provide a quick overview. Yeah. So as Angie mentioned, one of the things we try to do is we try to take what's been learned through the science, and which is often really good information, but maybe not too attainable or accessible for people to distill down into practice. And so these models you see on the screen, and we're only going to talk about a couple of them, are examples of such things. So the last time we discussed, we looked at the CAR aspect of this model. So I'm going to step back a little bit and talk about motivation in a different light. I think it's important for us to really be mindful of language. If we look back through history, language has also often been the source of contention and conflict, misunderstanding. And as you know, when we work with clients or students or organizations, it's often the language that's problematic, right? The language isn't necessarily indicative or reflective of the intention or what's in the heart, right? And so what I'm trying to do with this motivation conversation is to encourage people to start to decouple really what motivation is so that we could get on the same page, so that we can be more effective in monitoring our own motivation, monitoring that of our team and supporting them, right? There's so much out there about motivation hacks and all these different things. And what I'm hoping to do is propose a framework that provides a little bit more clarity to everyone so that they can utilize it much more effectively. So getting onto the CAR aspect of the model. So this is based off of the self-determination literature. And the idea here is that it's called the organismic view. And the idea here is that we all have three foundational needs. And those needs are represented by our terms CAR: competence, autonomy, and relatedness. And so if you think about Maslow's hierarchy, that pyramid model, this CAR concept is really at the foundational level of that. And actually, his model doesn't cleanly represent it the way we talk about it, because people have said that the psychological needs are partway up the model, and they're not wrong. We have, the needs vary, but what we're talking about is a needs-based motivation approach. And I think when we look at motivation through a needs-based approach, we begin to understand what people need to feel supported to flourish in the environment, right? So here you go. Simply put, CAR. So competence. Does the employee, it doesn't matter what it is, does a student have the ability to do, whether it's task or job, successfully, consistently, right? Simply put. Autonomy refers to independence and agency, right? Do they have the free will to choose as it relates to their work? And then the relatedness, or another way to think about it, is connection. Like a lot of the research is coming out as it relates to the real challenge with loneliness is that lack of connection. And connection in this regard is a foundational need of humans and all organisms. We can get into that in much more detail. But so we look at those three things, CAR. So these are the foundational elements that contributed into high quality intrinsic motivation. And so we use this with people to talk about, do they possess the basic psychological needs, CAR, and how does that factor into what's going on in their life, right? Oftentimes, I'm just going to jump ahead real quick. Oftentimes we talk about, well, we need to determine our purpose or what are our values. And those are really important concepts, but those, if you think about the Maslow pyramid, are much higher up towards the self-actualization level. And for so many people in the workforce and in life in general, they're not concerned about purpose right now or even values so much if their homes are being foreclosed or they're not sure how they're going to feed their family, right? We're talking about really foundational needs approach. And so then what we talk about is that we have car in the workplace, but then we also have car at home. And then the same we do with people is, like, let's just say you reached out and said, Rob, I don't know what to do with Fred. And apologies to Freds because Fred is my go-to name. So I don't know what to do with Fred. And so I often, in counseling them and supporting them, say, did you check their car? And the idea is that let's check their level of competence, autonomy, and relatedness at work. Yeah. And I often have people say, yeah, we did check their car and they're still floundering. They're not getting what they need. They're not doing what they need to be doing. And they say, well, did you check their car at home? And we know everyone has different opinions on asking about home life. But it's very clear that home life doesn't stop at the front door of the workplace, and that it does bleed in and it does touch other aspects of our life. So we often say, okay, let's talk about Fred. Let's go through his levels of competence. Has anything changed about his job? Is he still proficient in those areas? Yes. Okay. How about autonomy? Maybe change of leadership, maybe some micromanagement going on, right? Because if your competence is high, that autonomy needs to be there, right? We don't like our micromanagers, right? So we want to look at that. No changes in autonomy. How about the workforce? How about drama? How about people? How about that factor of relatedness, right? Like, are they receiving the level of relatedness they need in the workplace? And oftentimes people respond with no. I mean, yes, they are. They're just fine in these aspects. So then we look at home. So what's going on at home?
Yep. And for those of you that haven't watched the first one, that is on our website. It's on our Leader U, and I can send the link in that. But we go into this more in detail. So this is the recap of CAR and what those means. And it was competency, autonomy, and relatedness. So those were the three components for basic psychological needs, right?
Yeah.
So now we have the basic idea of what CAR is. So do you want to go into the rest of the model a little bit?
Yeah. So remember, the concepts of CAR are, think of it as, we're on the car metaphor, right? Think of it as fuel. And the quality of the C, the A, and the R will influence the quality of the intrinsic levels of regulation or motivation, right? And so if you move from the car item on the model to the left and you see that speedometer, the multicolor speedometer, what we want to look at is, or understand is that, high quality car leads into high quality green, right? High quality intrinsic motivation. So why did we create this model? Created it for a number of different reasons. One, motivation is one of the highest talked about concepts. It's right, one of those sexy terms in the workplace. But it's one of those things that I think people just don't know what to do with it.
Motivation means something different to me than to you, to anybody else when we're talking about motivation, language.
Exactly. Great point. And then the other thing I look at is that, look, a lot of people say if there's an incentive, I'll work harder, right? Well, most organizations, most leaders at that immediate leader level don't have discretion over adjusting those external incentives, right? So it's a weird dynamic that we talk about motivation in terms of extrinsic and intrinsic, as if those are the only two options that exist. Now, we understand the intrinsic stuff is that we do the stuff because we love the stuff, because it's fulfilling, it's meaningful, and maybe aligns with our purpose, getting higher up.
Values, yeah.
Yeah, Maslow, right? But the extrinsic side, once again, if you're my boss, you just can't determine, look, you do these tasks and I'll give you a raise. Or it's not that simple unless you're in a commission sales environment, which that's baked into the system. It's dependable and that can work. But for most people, it can't work. So it leaves leaders kind of rendered kind of nothing to work with here. I could cheerlead you based on my internal motivation, my intrinsic motivation, but that doesn't do anything to you. If anything, it might make you feel a little bit more crummy. So let's get into the other two areas in the model. So If you go from red, which is the E, which is extrinsic, we move up into that orange model, that orange section, that's SE. So I just use the S for somewhat or slightly extrinsic. It's still definitely heavily extrinsic compared to intrinsic. But what does that mean? So what we're trying to do here is we're breaking our traditional 2-item motivation framework into 4 items so that we can better navigate how to influence and support others, right? I don't believe that, and I know we use the language, you need to motivate your people. And I think part of the problem is that when we tell people that, they think that they have control over that. And my belief is that we need to be careful with that language, as I mentioned early on, that all we can do is cultivate the conditions.
An environment.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
To help them thrive and flourish. And sometimes we can't do it well. So in that orange category, that somewhat externalized category, we call that imposed. It's a kind of a condition of motivation that's imposed. It's well, if you think about it, it's like if you have children and you've raised teenagers, or I can speak from my own experience. When I was a teenager, I was imposed upon a lot. Like, oh, you make sure you go to a good college, make sure you get a good degree. If you want this quality of life, make sure you do this. Don't do that to your hair. Don't have
Wear
earrings.
this, don't do that. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So constantly imposed on us. And what we know about feedback and advice is that we don't like feedback or advice unless we're willing or open to it, right? So it's one thing for me to vent to you just to get something off my chest. I feel better, I move on. But it's something different when you turn around and start telling me the solutions or how to deal with my frustrations. I didn't ask you, right? So I'm not ready for that. I'm not in the mindset for that. I might be tomorrow and I'll come back. But right now, that's not where I want to be. And so what we see is when that unsolicited advice and direction comes in, there's a direct tie to demotivation, so diminished quality of motivation, which is interesting because if you go back to our fuel sources, advice is a form of diminishing autonomy. And so
Dirty gas.
dirty gas, yeah. Yeah, we want to keep that gas clean.
Right. Yeah.
So it's something to be mindful of. So don't get me wrong, there's times in the workplace where we have to say, look, Fred, you need to get that done, and I need you to get it done now. And I could tell Fred that, and he does it no problem due to a variety of internal conditions that he's experiencing. That's fine. But for other people, that might not be fine, or they might not understand why they're receiving that directive. And I'm not saying we have to handhold everyone. I think part of the solution to all of this, and some people do this really well, is get to know your people. Get to know them each individually so you know how to kind of cross those bridges with them, how you can cultivate that motivation. So instead of directing something at someone like, Fred, you need to do this, how can you soften that tone? How can you bring it to him under a different light, right? Let's look at the yellow section, the SI section. So that's closer to intrinsic levels of motivation, intrinsic regulation. So if we take Fred again, and we want to move into this yellow space so that he's more intrinsically motivated, that he's drawing upon some of his passions, we're going to change our delivery with that conversation. And let's just make this assumption. Fred's a weekend warrior. He has a lot of fun on the weekend. His weekend time and his after work time is really important to him. He protects it. Doesn't want to give it away to the workplace, which is fine. It's just good. You know, you're not being, it doesn't fit into your model. You're not being compensated for it. So, and that sometimes we have to do stuff. But I'm just saying, like in general, he's off doing stuff. Well, let's say I have something that comes across my desk that we have an initiative that we need to run over the weekend, and I need a representative from our office. But knowing Fred and knowing what this initiative is, Fred makes good sense for this initiative because it aligns with what I know about him, about his passions, that he likes to help kids in after-school programs, that he wants to give back to the community. So instead of me just telling him at that SE or that imposed category, Fred, I want you to do this, I need you to do this, I can soften that delivery with, Fred, I have an opportunity and I thought about you for this opportunity. And I can get into that dialogue space with him that hopefully piques some of that intrinsic motivation, right? Because many times I see people pushing back on direction from organizations because they don't quite understand how it fits into their framework. They might not see how this is part of their job, or they might just be having a rough day and emotionally they're bringing some of that in and it's disruptive to them, right? Like it's disrupting their views of what's going on. So by using this SI category or this aligning category, what I'm trying to do is align the objectives and goals of the organization with the values, interests, and purpose of the individual. So now I could present this to Fred as an opportunity and share with him that, a lot of leaders will be there. We know it's aligned with what you really want to do and help children in our community. I'm happy to answer any questions you have at this point. And at that point, who knows how it goes from there? It's a conversation between the two of them. But that conversation feels very different from, let's start with the extrinsic category. I'll give you a couple of days off next week. So now there's a quid pro quo. I get something because you give me something or you require something of me, to the I need you to do this. I'm imposing this on you. This will be good for your career. It might be very true, but it just might not land well with him, to the I think this could be something of interest to you. So I wanted to bring it to you first before I went to anyone else. And then what actually happens with Fred when that? He feels valued. Yeah. He feels supported. He feels recognized.
There's also the third piece, which is you're doing this. It's mandatory. There's one other one.
Right.
Like not I need you to or I'll ask. There's just this is what you're doing.
Yeah,
right?
And that's very much that imposed piece, right? Yeah. Like, and we know that that's further away from that high level motivation.
Right. And so when you're talking about extrinsic motivators and you're looking in the E's, the extrinsic and somewhat extrinsic, those would be classified as more like the carrots and sticks.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So consequences and rewards, right? And what we do know, generally speaking, is that if we pay a fair value to a person for that work, they're generally satisfied. Like, I believe everyone starts in every organization optimally motivated. They want to do a good job for themselves. They want to do a good job for those people in their life outside of work. And they want to do a good job for the organization. If I'm new and you're the supervisor, I put a lot of pressure on myself that I want to do a good job to make you proud that you selected me, which actually leads into other problems because sometimes I might be afraid to ask questions out of fear of not looking like I know what's going on.
The other thing is the person has agreed to the pay. So when they accepted the job, they recognize that it's enough for them. It meets their needs. To meet their needs. Now, I'm not talking about down the years not getting.
Right.
We need to keep up with the times as it relates to getting basic needs met.
Yeah.
But once basic needs are met, then it really doesn't matter. Can you share how the research supports that the more extrinsic, it actually doesn't lead to better performance?
No, well, it's often strings attached, right? So. I mentioned commissioned work. Commissioned work is typically pretty straightforward and clear. If I do X, I get Y, right? So, and it's stable over time, pretty stable. But, organizations are volatile. And sometimes they could give raises, sometimes they can't. Sometimes they could give bonuses, sometimes they choose not. Like what we're seeing right now in the market are record earnings, and we're still seeing these flurries of layoffs, and we're going to have another big push of that, I think, even though organizations are doing very well, right? So, what we know is that, if I'm going to give you've been doing double duty because someone left, I'm going to give you a pay bump to keep doing that. And that makes you happy. But at some point you settle back in that is no longer enough, right? And there's not going to be another pay bump unless you leave. And that's something else to mention too, is that sometimes we just mature out of the roles we're in, right? I might have started a job, let's say, $40,000. I think that was one of my first jobs ever. I was like, wow, that's awesome. But you become interested in things. You grow hobbies. You start a family or you travel. And so your lifestyle adjusts. So that 40 is maybe not enough anymore. So now I need to find something else. It might be very true that I just need to leave the job. Like I've tapped out in the potential in that position and I can go somewhere else. But that's a great opportunity to move back into another organization, optimally motivated, do good work, and continue to grow yourself.
Absolutely. So there's a good, when we're getting into the intrinsic, what kinds of things like what people value, what their purpose is, what's meaningful to them. And that really takes reflection. I know that the organizations and people that we've worked with on an individual basis, many people haven't really thought about some of this stuff and really figured out what really does fuel them and what is their clean gas and what sucks the life out of them as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, right. What's one of our biggest stumpers when we do a warm up with a group and we ask them, "What's your why? What's your
Purpose or your
calling in
mission.
life?" Yeah, and it's something we've been reflecting on even ourselves for years that we still continue to refine and dig deeper in discovery, and so it's easy to forget because of the privilege we have in our roles at times that other people are just not seeing things where we're at.
Yeah.
And
Curse of knowledge.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
And experience.
Exactly. And, I was thinking about something the other day, too, because we did this once and someone said, well, my motivation right now is to pay my rent, right? And so if you actually look at that wheel or the semicircle, that would probably fall in that imposed, somewhat externalized thing that they're working as a condition for finances so that they can fulfill basic needs, right? So until that person moves out of that mindset or the economy shifts or something alleviates that pressure, then they're not gonna move into this purpose space necessarily.
Or learning space or development space.
Right. Exactly.
Right. So are you ready for some more questions?
Yeah, I'm ready for questions.
Okay. We'll come back to Nicole's question because that's a good one. But I have, let's see. How do you handle people that don't want to attend training? If I understand part one for motivation, you want to nurture autonomy. So shouldn't we give people options to attend training and development?
Yeah, we don't want to be imposing on people oftentimes. So we really wrestle with this. And for some reason, and the challenge it seems to be is that the leader prioritizes learning and development, but they don't feel that it's significant enough for their employees to be a part of that team, that they don't require it. And I really wrestle with that, right? The most fun we've had, I think, in some of these development sessions actually have come at regional and national conferences with groups that we know nothing about in general, right? A group in the Pacific Northwest, a forensic group. This is a great model. We love these groups. They invited us in for a day boot camp on leadership. And what they did was on that day, people got to choose between certain firearm investigation stuff, certain DNA investigation stuff, or leadership boot camp, right? Which one sounds the most fun? Not us, that's for sure. But people still came. But the point here is that they had the autonomy to choose and they self-selected and they geeked out and loved it and they leaned in and they really enjoyed it, right? So, but that's not what we can always do in our workplace.
Right.
I think about it, can I also add about my students, right? So I do that. I have a couple different science and motivation courses and they're like, well, why are you requiring these assignments? And I said, well, that's the condition of work here, that you're coming to university to receive a certain outcome. This is the condition of our agreement, is that I'm going to guide you in that. And I could do that in different ways, but you essentially resigned all autonomy to go to college to some extent to learn the information to prepare you for life. Same thing with the workplace, I think. You're joining an organization. And it might not just be about producing widgets. It might be also about building people with character and communities and supporting things. But you're joining that organization around a cause, a very direct mission-focused cause, and maybe an unspoken cause, right? And that means you're signing up for a part of the cultural aspect of it. Some people put no time into culture. Some people put a lot of time in, and there's a lot of people in between. Whatever you choose is up to you. But when you accept that job, you're accepting to the tenets and responsibilities of the position, right? I think about, is it Burger King? The slogan is "Have it your way," right? If you want to have it your way, you either go to Burger King or you be an entrepreneur. Unfortunately, right? Like that is like we're signing up to work in a large organization, and there are certain things that come with that. Now, what can we do to soften that or to improve the alignment of people coming in? We can, through the hiring process, make it very clear that we prioritize culture and development and support and these different things.
And team over
And team.
I, right?
Yeah, team over I. Great concept right there, right? So this collective we in the organization, and that every person is a part of that collective we, not just us as individuals working side by side.
Yeah. I think about sports, and
Yeah.
you're a college athlete, and I
Yeah.
think about imagine signing up or getting a scholarship to go
Right.
play soccer and track, which
Yeah.
you did. Imagine if you told your coach, "I'm not really into that. I'm not
team
into
dinners
no,
or
I'm not. It's,
Yeah,
it's
I
just
think-
not really me. I'm not really into that. How do you think that would fly on a team?
Right, exactly. It's a condition for your participation, right? And so I feel very strongly that we should be supporting people and helping them understand that in this environment, or at least this team within this larger work environment, we prioritize that. And we're going to hire around people that have a certain mindset and that have a certain interest. So no, I believe in that. And then I also believe that we need to spend more time as organizations investing in human development, not task development, right? So I want to, I know we need to prepare that person that's the teller to do the drawer properly and all those functions of that organization, right? In that position. But I also believe that we have an opportunity, and I think it would help these other areas more to help develop them as a person, to help raise awareness, grow some mindsets, expose them to new ideas about themselves, right? Leverage those things about personality and behavior and leadership and things like that. Because I see that as almost a moral obligation for our society and our communities, because that totally follows and flows into life outside of work as well as task at hand.
Absolutely. It impacts their life in such a meaningful way when they get those skills that are transferable, that they can take home and they can take to their families and to their communities and to the nonprofits that they may be. When you develop your people and you create a culture like that, it's got a ripple effect out into the community.
Absolutely.
So you use the word an opportunity and obligation to really clearly. These are called soft skills,
Right.
which I really hate that term. We know that the term soft skills comes from the military because those are the human skills. The harder skills were like the guns and the tanks and these types of things. But I say they're the actual hard skills because they're the things that people struggle with the most. And we know that people get hired for skill and fired for behaviors. So we're doing people a disservice when we're not helping them to develop. We're not showing them their strengths, giving them opportunities for improvement. And some of these things, it takes a lot of years. You don't do a one and done training.
Oh, absolutely.
This is something that is a commitment to growth and development. And you really want to attract those people that are, when you're interviewing your people, you're asking them, how important is development of you? Give me some examples of how you've invested in yourself.
Yeah.
Not just how is your organization invested in you. How do you invest in yourself? Is it all external, what you look like and what you're wearing and all those things? Or what classes have you taken? What certifications have you got? What extra courses? What YouTube videos do you watch? Like, what are you doing to invest in yourself?
Yeah.
And your skill, in your human skills?
I think something that you've said a couple things that kind of make me think about the role of training, and you mentioned cursive knowledge. And one of the challenges I notice is that leaders with a certain level of cursive knowledge bring in trainers to do certain things, right? And it doesn't stick, whether that's culture, motivation, what have you. And I think it's important for us to reflect that there's a gap that exists between whatever that knowledge piece is, and we're not talking about routine tasks in the workplace. We're talking about something that's new information that we want to transfer into the workplace to use. And too often, we don't build that bridge between the two. That I could come in and talk about motivation, all about work and how we do this in the workplace, and then send them off and try to make them do it, or have them do it, or let them do it, align them to do it, whatever. But it's not going to happen in many instances, because what we know is that the training transfer is actually quite weak in most things, because we didn't scaffold it properly from the self. And so if you want to tweak training to be more impactful and have longevity of the knowledge, we need to do that initiative that really builds upon their own lived experiences outside of work before we transfer it into that work context. So we can still do it as a full day workshop with a team, but we need to make sure that our delivery really aligns with the objectives there of implementation in the end, right? So it's the same thing as going back to what I said at the beginning. Why did I find this as a path now? It's because, and if we use training as an analogy, that straight up training doesn't work a lot of times because we're making the assumption that people are all static and consistent. And so we have to augment that so that we recognize and embrace that they're dynamic and inconsistent and that our methodologies have to follow that. And that goes from training, that goes to leading, that goes to supporting, all these different things.
And I would say it's the same as it relates to going to a conference. What do you actually bring back from a conference, right? It's like you're super motivated for 3 or 4 days and you've got a few ideas, but then you don't have the system that supports it, or you don't have a way to put it into action. It's the same thing. You could read a book, but that doesn't mean you know how to implement it. You think you see the same stuff with diet and exercise. We all know what to do. Doing it, the practice, the habits, the skill set of doing those things is what it takes. It's breaking things down and kind of reverse engineering and keeping it part of the culture and keeping it alive so that they're getting micro doses of this infiltration and learning instead of here's all this knowledge, now go have fun, now go do it.
Yeah. So you mentioned books and, there's so much information out there. Knowledge is power, but it's more powerful when it's accurate and correct, right? And I was thinking about this last week, how so much of the information I come across is projected as truths, and research is a great example of that. Like how things change over time, like our understanding of everything, neuroscience, motivation, all these things have evolved, right? But too often we double down on some certain things that we pick up. And for anyone reading, whether it's a blog or even a book for that matter, context is important. And this goes to this leadership lesson too. Context is huge, right? So if you want to distill some knowledge from a post or from a book about motivation, I would say that, and this is just a total crude estimate, like 30% of the information is really true and accurate. The rest of the success of the information is contextual. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, that you just can't take one thing that we've done and just impart it because it's going to work in this other organization. There's some specificity and customization that goes there.
Yeah, absolutely. So as it relates to the model, well, actually, we have a couple of questions coming in.
We've
got a couple here. So let's go back to Nicole's because she asked.
It's gone.
It's gone now.
Let's go to this one.
And you can pull this one up. So how do I lead people to have higher levels of autonomy, even though it's their job to do those specific things?
Yeah. There's another question that came in that sounds similar to that too. How do I continue to motivate your team when you do not receive much motivation or recognition yourself from your leads, right? And those are very similar things. Being a leader is a wonderful opportunity, and it could be a tough thing at times, right? No doubt. It's probably one of the most difficult things out there because it's usually the least prepared type of role you have. You're often an expert at a trade or a craft or something, and then you become a leader because you've excelled in that environment. So there's often some strings attached to that. To me, it's about getting to know your people and generating that trust and that alignment between people, and so that you could have those conversations. People talk about recognition and how important recognition is. I think recognition is overstated, and actually, if you look at the motivation model, it's potentially a form of extrinsic motivation. It could be a carrot that people become dependent on recognition. And when the recognition disappears, then the performance wanes because they're not being recognized anymore. I think what's more accurate is that when we see times that people are wanting more recognition, it's a symptom of something larger. And I think my go-to on that is psychological safety and a lack thereof. So we're not getting into that today. But as a person that might not receive a lot of support, you're in a tough spot. But are you able to be compassionate and lead with a certain level of vulnerability, right? So we know that when people become more vulnerable, they're able to connect with other people better, whether that's socially, relationally, and even in the workplace. And vulnerability is not a weakness. It's actually a strength, right? And it's one of our tenets and our beliefs. And so the more we can cultivate these really low risk vulnerability opening sessions where we can share with people how we're feeling, how we're concerned about things, check-ins with them to see how they're doing, a little litmus test, check-ins, stuff like that. We talk about the moodometer and the emotions check-ins at that time. We're creating this dialogue with people to feel like they're in an environment that they're supported so that we could have these conversations, right? Our goal is to drive out the superficiality of things so that we could be a little bit more candid, so that you can ask for help, so that you can tell me without fear of retaliation that you're struggling right now. And so prioritizing one-on-ones, that's an important thing. Like, not everyone could prioritize professional development funds, but I don't know any organization that can't integrate, and I know a lot that don't, regular one-on-ones with people. And too often people are like, well, I'm too busy. I got a lot going on. Well, if I'm your leader, I'm going to schedule these one-on-ones with you, and we're going to keep them to that because that's our time to have conversations about whatever you want to talk about. What's going on at work, what's going on in the team, what you might need assistance with, right? Because if you back it out and we don't have those opportunities, and we talk to people and they're like, well, we just run into each other enough in the hallway and all over the place that we just have these conversations. And I'm like, well, how are those conversations working out? Well, not really great, actually. We're not accomplishing what we need to accomplish, or there's conflict here. Let's show someone we value them and give them some dedicated time. Maybe it's 20 minutes, 25 minutes, 30 minutes, or an hour, whatever it is. This is your time to have this conversation with me. And we want to talk about bringing this even more vulnerable. And in this time, you can give me feedback about how I'm doing as a leader and a supporter of you. And at this time, I'll also give you feedback. And, we're lumping a lot of things into this motivation thing, but all this stuff relates to motivation. That feedback, and we talked about how it can be tricky at times, feedback is an important mechanism that's related to motivation. Those one-on-ones are beautiful opportunities to provide drips of feedback, positive and negative, into the conversation so that there's no surprises, so that you know where your team's doing, you know when your individuals are struggling, how you can support them and work through these challenges.
One of the things that I have seen over and over, and I know you have as well, is when someone addresses the entire team about whatever this thing that went wrong, or someone's late, and they address the entire team. And talk about how that can suck the motivation out of the rest of the team.
Well, we had a question somewhere at some point. Someone asked, that's right in line with that is,
how do people lose motivation?
Yeah, if you believe they enter the organization with motivation, how do they lose motivation? Well, they attend a meeting where someone gives them information like that, right? So, we rise to certain standards, or we fall to certain standards, or we're only as good as our weakest link type of concepts, right? And so what I think we don't realize we're doing as leaders is every time we're not having a conversation, we're building a part of our profile for the person on the other end reading us, right? Like, they're learning what we're willing to stand up for and what we're not. And so when I address everyone globally, when it's only an issue with one or two people, I'm cutting my legs out from under me. I'm renorming the organization to the extent of letting people know that it's okay not to do what they've signed up to do, right? And so that happens a lot. And
accountability is real. It's a thing.
And I get it. Like, you know my story.
Yeah.
Years and years of a lack of confrontation and accountability skills, and it just made a mess of my younger life. And so it's so important, but it's so darn hard, right? People need people need the skill, the support, the vulnerability, the perspectives. And what all these things require is time. You can't just be, I'm super busy. And that's one of the things we saw become more pervasive in the language over COVID, that, oh, I'm so busy. Oh, this, I'm busy. Oh. And, to some extent, we start becoming what we believe, right? But if we take care of our people, it creates time.
Yeah.
It takes time to move them from that imposed, that line category. But if I do that enough and I cultivate that and I move them from a point of externalized influence or externalized regulation in their motivational behavior into that intrinsic, I no longer have to worry about the problems that they're dealing with. That I could step back and be more effective leading and creating as opposed to putting out those little fires. And so I think that's a really important thing, is that we do need to be stronger at those accountability conversations. And let's just be honest. They're hard, they're tricky, but everyone wants it. Like, people want to know where they're not doing well.
They don't want to find out from their coworkers that you've
That's
talked
for
about
sure.
them, or that you're their boss and you're talking behind their back. That is what they don't want to find out, and we see this a lot too.
Yeah, but
Right.
it's this weird dynamic, right? Because this is where we're not static. We're complex. I know I made a mistake. I'm expecting you to call me out. When you don't, I lose faith in your capabilities, right? Because I know you know. But then you call me out, and then I get ticked off, and I feel hurt. Well, that's just a reaction. It's emotional reaction to, we feel like something's attacked us, even though I fully knew about that. And the nice thing is that when I fully knew and I react to that, I'm going to move out of that experience really quickly. That I'm going to bounce back quickly. But there's more damage when we don't have that conversation.
Absolutely. You could maybe share an experience that you had an employee one time.
Yes. A good friend from a long time ago, and he was a good worker, and I was living in a really remote area, and we really were challenged with hiring. And so I encouraged him to come out and join us, and he came out, and great guy, and did a great job. But he moved into that mindset of, I don't get paid enough for this, or this is what other places are getting paid. And
You got tired of it?
yeah, and I didn't get tired of it so much as I knew it wasn't helping him, and I loved him as a person, as a colleague, right? And so he would say, look at all these other places that we knew about. They were paying this, this, and this. And it was just a case of the grass is always greener, right?
Right.
And so finally I said, well, how many of them offered you a job? And it just stopped him in his tracks. And he was pissed. And he stormed out. And but the next day came back. He said, Rob, I needed to hear that. I knew that. I needed to hear that. And that's so true for a lot of things. That doesn't mean it doesn't sting when we get that feedback. But it's an important part of our own flourishing and success, right? And we know what emotions do when we hold them up, and they create ailments, sickness, and just not good. We need to help this stuff pass through.
Right. Absolutely.
Any other questions coming in?
Let's see. Any thoughts on dopamine hit as it relates to motivation? There's a lot about a talk about hacking motivation.
Yeah. Motivation hacks in general, right? Like, so let's keep the dopamine separate. You know what? We're all looking for a quick fix, right? And oftentimes, regardless what it is, food, diet, exercise, motivation, don't we just need to break it down and get back to the basics? And you get to determine what those basics are, right? Like, so that's the powerful thing that's really coming through. If you take a really a super broad view of the research coming out with respect to happiness and expectations, like a lot of our happiness is tied to our expectations, and what we and those expectations are often the things that are letting us down or surprising us, right? And so motivation hacks, there's things you could do to try to do that dopamine hit so that I feel more interested to do X, Y, and Z. But that to me is more of that. We've talked about this before in the last one, and we didn't talk about this, the junk food motivation, right? Like, so I talk about there's some motivation frameworks because we use the word to explain a lot of things. And this is where I want us to get back to that needs-based foundation, junk food motivation. And it doesn't mean that these other things aren't helpful or good, but my concern is that they're not adequately fueling the person as it relates to motivation, right? So if you think about eating junk food, like I could eat a bag of chips, and I love chips, and that could be my fuel for the day. In calorie-wise, there's nothing wrong with that in terms of being a surplus of calories potentially, but a calorie is a calorie is a calorie. But if I continue just to put that poor quality and chemical stuff into me, it's going to affect me in the long term. And I think about that with respect to some of the motivation concepts too, right? Like sometimes we talk a lot about preferences and values and motives at a higher level on Maslow's pyramid. But the challenge also is that if you can't continue to manage those things, they're just going to be fleeting, and your people are still not going to be satisfied and fulfilled. And my worry about a lot of that is, at what point do we shift from cultivating intrinsic motivation to looking for these other solutions to motivation for people so that they can hack their work environment, so that they can have higher levels of motivation? Like it's something I really wrestle with. But as it relates to the dopamine, because it's interesting, I followed a couple writings over the years that have evolved, and that's what we need to know. All the science is evolving, and we got to be careful in doubling down on what we are declaring, especially as practitioners. Like I look at the scholars, they're in their space and they're doing what they need to be doing. But from a practitioner lens, we're taking some of that information, what we hear, and we recraft it in our own words, and then we push it out there. And a perfect example of this is I was reading this morning on LinkedIn as a little blurb that talks about how mindfulness is a dopamine hit. And if you listen to some other people and you read some other studies that are more current than that, the dopamine hit with mindfulness occurs when it's new. And so dopamine's often tied to new experiences or exciting experiences, not just because I can have these events over time, I'm going to continue to trigger these dopamine. That's the concept of the dopamine motivation hack, is what can you do that's going to give you an exhilaration and you ride that exhilaration into interest and effort. Well, I think it's more important that we be honest with ourselves. Like, I really hate doing this type of work. I love doing this work. How do I make this work that's a requirement of mine more in line with where my purpose and my goals and my love is, so that I can make it more enjoyable? And part of the answer is maybe you need to leave. Like maybe you have too much of this work that doesn't align with your soul or what your interest is, and you need to find work that does more of that.
Or maybe you need some training, some skills, and somebody to mentor you in something. Let's say you have to do a budget once a year, and you're not very good at it. Or you have to manage a whole database. I think about jobs that I've had where I'm managing a ton of data. It's not my favorite stuff to do, but I know that I had to do it in my role. So I would find people that were really good at that would help me create a system. And once I had a system, it would be easy for me to manage things. So you have to know what you're good at, what you're not, and then also know on your team who's good at certain things and who likes to be like, you're really good at building data and spreadsheets and helping me with that. I don't like doing that, but I have to manage the data. But if you create it for me, I can keep things organized, right? So it's knowing your strengths, knowing what the other people's strengths are, and asking more questions. It does take a lot more time in the beginning, but it helps when everybody starts to get aligned and they start to help each other out as well.
Well, something else that actually happens that's really beautiful, and I've seen this firsthand in the organizations I've led, as well as working with different groups, is that when you cultivate that environment of authenticity and vulnerability and compassion, and you integrate accountability and regular drips of feedback, and you move into that alignment space instead of that imposed space, people begin to become more self-sufficient, independent, but they also become more we-based as opposed to I-based. As I do this with my entire team, so that then what they start to do is they start to hold each other accountable. They start to bring each other up. They start to manage their own selves independent of the leader, and not as an adversarial role, but as a role that they're taking care of their needs, and then they turn to their leader for that wisdom, for that leadership, for what do we need, or how do we get these resources, things like that. And so it's to me, it's like a beautiful orchestra. It's a beautiful thing to see when you could step back and those people are just, they're taking care of things. They're, hey boss, I just want to let you know, I had this difficult conversation with Fred and I think it went well. It was about X, Y, and Z. But just letting you know so that if anything comes up or if he has anything to say to you, just putting it on your radar. Awesome. Who doesn't want to be at that space? But it just doesn't happen. It takes time to cultivate and grow that.
Yeah, and that psychological safety, which is another thing. We have a question here. When you're onboarding people to your team, what tools do you use to help them uncover their why, purpose, mission?
So our more successful clients at this use a range of assessments we offer, whether it's personality, motives, values, communication styles, behavioral styles, stuff like that. And what they actually do is, because the teams have been through all this stuff, and this is an integrated part of their culture, it's part of their foundational language base, so they're all on the same page. We encourage them to bring that forward with their hires. And that's immediately a part of that onboarding process, so that new hire comes in, onboarding day, they get some results that they completed. They get to see where their team is at. They get to see where their leader is. And then they get to listen from, whether it's the onboarding agent or the leader or a mentor, about how we prioritize this culture of learning, development, using tools like these, and how this is parlayed into the success of the organization, right? So I think there is, and that's a great question, there is a real true need to revisit how we regard mission, vision, and how we onboard people with respect to that. And if our systems get too big, it's too transactional. And but the other side of it too is, and we've all been through orientation, it's like drinking through a fire hose. That's a lot of information, from benefits to holidays to all these different things that, let's be honest, that in that first part of the day, that new employee experience, they're not really all that interested in. There's certain pieces that are really key, but for certain things like, do we have an EAP program? They might not be interested or curious about that until 6, 8, 10, 12 months later, right? So I'm not saying we can't do it and we shouldn't do it. I'm just saying there's a lot going at them.
Right.
So maybe we could bring some more of the joyous aspects of this that relate to culture, purpose, right? And so the other piece of it is, how can you integrate this more? This is a part of your regular staff meeting, regular development initiatives, and regular one-on-ones, right? You're always protecting time for the people, for the we, for the organization, for the team, and have these conversations. And it doesn't need to be a lot of time.
Yeah.
It could be a 15-minute conversation about check-in on how people are doing, and actually having people provide lead on a topic they want to share. Like, we're just not getting straight to business.
Yeah, and we also need to recognize 5 to 10 minutes on any meeting drips. It should start in your interview.
Yeah.
Really, when you're onboarding, when you're thinking about bringing someone onto your team, those would be a really good opportunity to be asking these people what their why, their purpose, and their mission is. If they don't know, how would it align with this organization? So I would even take it back a little bit further. And each stage of the employee life cycle, you're bringing it to life in different ways. And it's not all at once. It's small drips throughout the employee experience.
Yeah. And, how do you crack that nut of screening people, right? That's super tough. And there's one tool out there that I really believe highly in, and it looks at values and motives for fit in the organization, right? And because what's my objective as a person trying to get this job? My job
To get the job.
is to get the job. So I'm going to be everything to you that you want me to be. And this one tool,
It's like online dating.
yeah. This one tool helps get behind that, because if we want a more serious environment, or if I'm, as a candidate, I really strive in serious structured environments, and your environment is fun and lighthearted and there's beer and popcorn every Friday, it might not align with where I want to be. But you're gonna be really hard pressed to pull that out in an interview series to determine whether or not that fits there. So that's a element or an aspect of this to be mindful of.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are out of time. So I think what you should know is that anyone who has joined us through LinkedIn, I don't have your email. So if you want the recording, that would be, you could message us and we will get that to you. We just need to have your email, or you could sign up for our newsletter on our website at blackriverpm.com. As soon as you go onto the website, it'll give you an opportunity. If you signed up through an Eventbrite, you will get a recording. You just have to be on our newsletter. I really appreciate your time and for being here. And
this is
being
fun.
A guest.
We don't do this. You do this every week. This is interesting. I don't want to do what you do. I don't want to be the talker. I'll just be the blabber.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate you all joining us, and stay tuned to have the recording. If you just joined us on the second part 2, I would highly recommend going back to part 1 and revisiting that. And please share it with your network if you found it valuable. We appreciate it.
I'd also say, like, since I'm a part of this too, if you found this valuable, let us know. Like, we have other models, we have other perspectives. They're all based off of this type of translation of research. Let us know, and we could do this more frequently if there's interest in our alignment model, our peak performance model, our succession planning model, like all these different things. Let us know. Reach out to us. You can visit us on our LinkedIn profiles individually and message us there. You could track us down off of our website.
And you can always listen to the Leader You podcast.
Yeah.
Please, one of the ways you can support us is by liking, subscribing, and sharing, because this is us just giving knowledge and distilling it from getting knowledge and wisdom from our own experience and from the leaders that we get to work with, and really providing an arena for people to develop themselves. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Have a great day.
Appreciate it. Have a good day.